We're through 9 weeks of the fantasy football season. I can honestly say at this point of the year, this is the strongest and deepest the running back position has been in quite some time. Now, sure, we got some guys like Josh Jacobs and Kenneth Walker on bye, but the running back position is still sitting 25 deep with some awesome fantasy options. Oh yeah, and we could be getting back Christian McCaffrey. Now, before we dive into the quick and dirty top 36 running backs here for Week 10 fantasy football, like usual, we always bring up a few of my bigger hits and misses from the week prior. Now, when it comes to a few of my bigger hits, how about Josh Jacobs, Chase Brown, and Breece Hall? But what about Chase Brown? Dude had ridiculous volume. He was a huge bonus to a lot of people last week. But I did have some misses as well. J.K. Dobbins, Rico Dowdle, and Chuba Hubbard. Now, obviously, when it comes to Chuba, he showed that he can score some touchdowns even with Bryce Young under center. Now, that was great to see. Now, can he do it again this week? Let's go ahead and dive into the Week 10 rankings starting in Tier 1. And right here in Tier 1 is where we have Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson, Devon Achane, Alvin Kamara, and Jonathan Taylor. Now for Saquon Barkley right here at the top going against Dallas. He's the current RB3 overall, averaging 20.9 fantasy points per game. He's one of only 3 running backs in the NFL that is currently averaging over 20 fantasy points per game. It's him, Henry, and Joe Mixon. He's also had at least 110 total yards in all but one game this year. We know A.J. Brown is hurting, and Dallas allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so I got Saquon Barkley at number 1. Number 2, it's Derrick Henry going up against Cincinnati. The King is still the number 1 overall running back through 9 weeks of the season, averaging just under 22 fantasy points per game, and has at least 1 touchdown in every single game this season. He also has over 130 total yards in 5 of his last 7 contests. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows over 18 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and the more that Baltimore can run the ball successfully, the less Joe Burrow has the ball and can put up points on them. Now after Henry, we got Kyren Williams going up against Miami, and he finally had a game without a touchdown in Week 9. However, still got us over 10 fantasy points on the week. He's had now at least 10 fantasy points in every single game this year. Puka and Kupp on the field just pull defenders outside of the box and make it easier for Kyren Williams. Now a matchup going up against Miami. They allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Kyren's at number 3. At 4, it's Bijan going up against New Orleans, and he continues to be hot. He now has 4 straight games over 100 total yards and 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games as well. Also love to see 18 plus touches in 4 straight ball games. We know that Drake London is dealing with a hip injury, and New Orleans allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Bijan's at number 4. Number 5 is Devon Achane going up against the Rams. Everyone talks about the big plays and the touchdowns, but we really need to bring to light the passing work that is keeping him super safe weekly. With Tua under center, Devon Achane has had at least 7 targets, 6 catches, and 50 yards receiving in each game. Now he has a matchup going up against the Rams, who allow almost 21 fantasy points per contest to opposing running backs. Devon Achane at number 5. Then we got Alvin Kamara at 6 going against Atlanta. And literally, no one else in this offense that is going to get a ton of volume. With the Chris Olave injury last week, we saw Alvin Kamara get 35 touches. He's the current running back 4 overall and should be close to 10 targets a week with Chris Olave out. Now, these two teams faced off a few weeks ago, and Alvin Kamara had 119 yards and a touchdown. With the added usage now, I got Alvin Kamara at number 6. Then we go down to number 7, it's Jonathan Taylor going up against Buffalo. And don't let a bad game last week against one of the best run defenses in the NFL detract you from the point that Jonathan Taylor is still much better when Joe Flacco is at quarterback than when Anthony Richardson is. Now a matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the running back position, and the only team that allows more than them is the Carolina Panthers. So that gets us through Tier 1. Let's go down to Tier 2, where we got Joe Mixon, Jahmyr Gibbs, Aaron Jones, Christian McCaffrey, Kareem Hunt, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Breece Hall, Tyrone Tracy, and James Conner. But at the top of the tier, I got Joe Mixon going up against Detroit. He is the true constant in this offense here as of late. He's had at least 100 yards and a touchdown in all but one game this season. Now, Nico Collins could return this week, which is only going to help open up running lanes for Joe Mixon. He's averaging 23 touches a game, but it's a tough matchup going against Detroit, who allows the 6th fewest fantasy points per contest. But listen to this, Detroit has also allowed 3 straight running backs to go over 100 total yards against them. That's why I'm keeping Joe Mixon right here at the top of tier 2 at number 8. Then we got his opponent in that game, Jahmyr Gibbs, and he's been one of the most consistent running backs this entire year. Only 1 game all season with under 14 fantasy points. Detroit, they're always playing with a lead and they're putting big time points on the scoreboard. Gibbs has touchdowns in 6 of 8 games, and now a matchup going up against Houston is not an easy one. They allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points per contest to opposing running backs. But here's an odd stat. Houston has allowed 150 plus rushing yards in 3 of their 4 home games this season. This game, at home, in Houston, Jahmyr Gibbs still at number 9. At number 10, it's Aaron Jones going up against Jacksonville. And really a different kind of Aaron Jones this year. He's more safe than ceiling. He's had 10 plus fantasy points in all but 2 games this year, but no really big blow-up games. He's averaging the most touches per game of his entire career. Touchdowns are just a little bit more hard to come by with all the weapons in Minnesota. But now a matchup going up against Jacksonville, they allow the 4th most fantasy points per contest to opposing running backs, so Aaron Jones at number 10. Now after Aaron Jones, it's Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers going up against Tampa Bay. Is it finally time for the long-awaited return of CMC? Now if he does play, how much does he play? That is the big question. I can't think he comes in his first game and gets some huge 20-plus touch role. But it's a great matchup going up against Tampa Bay. They allow the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and if he plays and you've stashed him for this long, you kind of got to throw him into your fantasy lineup. But when it comes to expectations, they may just be a little bit lower to start off. Now after McCaffrey, we got Kareem Hunt going up against the Denver Broncos, and so many touches for Kareem Hunt. Over the last 4 games, he's averaging almost 26 touches per game. Isaiah Pacheco is still a couple of weeks out, and the touchdown chances have been there weekly for Kareem Hunt. We see DeAndre Hopkins out there opening up the passing game, and now they have a matchup going up against Denver, who is easier to run on than throw on. Then we go down to DeAndre Swift going up against New England, and he continues to be a solid weekly option. He's had at least 10 fantasy points now in 5 straight games, averaging over 20 touches a game over that span. And even though he didn't have a huge week last week, he just ran into an Arizona defense that's playing really well right now. Now he gets a matchup going up against New England. They allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so DeAndre Swift at number 13. Which then brings us down to number 14. It's where I got James Cook of the Buffalo Bills going up against the Indianapolis Colts. Cook is the current running back 11 on the season. Now his yardage has been a little bit lower in 2 of his last 3 games, but the guy has touchdowns in 5 of 8 games this season. His ceiling is just so high, he isn't overly reliant on needing big time volume. In a matchup going up against Indianapolis, they allow right around the league average when it comes to fantasy points per game to the opposing running backs, so I got James Cook at 14. 15 is Breece Hall going up against Arizona, and a lot of low expectations from Breece here as of late. He's the current running back 19 overall, but he is still averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game. The biggest issue when it comes to Breece Hall is the lack of touchdowns. Only 1 touchdown over his last 6 games. And let's not overlook the fact that his passing volume is down as well. He averaged 7 targets a game in his first 7 games, now only has 7 targets total over his last 2 weeks combined. In a matchup going up against Arizona, they do allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to the running back position, so Breece Hall still up here inside the top 15 at number 15. Then we got Tyrone Tracy going up against Carolina, and it is a rule in fantasy football here in 2024, start your running backs against the Carolina Panthers. They're allowing almost 30 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Only 1 time all year have they allowed their opponent to have less than 100 total yards rushing. Tyrone Tracy up inside tier 2, as well as James Conner in that game going up against the Jets. And Conner is a huge part of the Arizona offense. 19 plus touches in 7 of 9 games this season, and he's done it against good defenses, he's done it against bad defenses. The only reason he is still the running back 22 overall is due to the lack of touchdowns. He only has 4 on the season. He definitely needs volume. If the touchdowns aren't there, we gotta try to rack up the yardage. Now in a matchup going up against the Jets, they're easier to run on than throw on, so James Conner right here at the bottom of tier 2. Which will then bring us down to tier 3, where I got J.K. Dobbins, David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson, Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, Najee Harris, and Tony Pollard. Now, let me say this. A lot of these guys right here in tier 3, I could make arguments for them to be up inside tier 2. When I said at the beginning of the video that the running back position is stronger than we've seen it in years at this point of the season, I wasn't lying. There's 24 guys that we've gone through that really deserve to have top 12 consideration. But let's go ahead and start here at the top of tier 3 with J.K. Dobbins going up against Tennessee. And really, the Cleveland defense is no more. J.K. Dobbins proved that just last week. But I talked about his need for touchdowns in that matchup, and he actually got them. Now he's up to running back 13 overall on the season, had at least 14 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4, and it's really helping him that Justin Herbert is opening up the passing game and throwing a little bit more. Defenses aren't coming into games and just expecting the Chargers to run the entire game. Now they're having to play the pass, which is pulling defenders outside of the box and helping out J.K. Dobbins. Now in a matchup going up against Tennessee, they allow over 21 fantasy points per game. How about David Montgomery going up against Houston? The every week touchdown guy hasn't had a touchdown now in 2 of his last 3 games played. Really no reason other than Jahmyr Gibbs seems to be vulturing them away here as of late. We know that David Montgomery is still heavily involved. He just had 20 touches in the game last week. He remains a solid weekly flex play, but it's a tough matchup going up against Houston, who allows the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we got Ramondre Stevenson going up against Chicago. And inefficiencies really don't matter when you can continue to find the end zone. Stevenson now has back-to-back games with 2 touchdowns and has climbed all the way up to the running back 22 overall on the season, averaging 13.2 fantasy points per game. He remains a decent running back too. In a matchup going up against Chicago, they allow the 12th most fantasy points per game. They're easier to run on than throw on. Then we go down to Chase Brown going up against Baltimore, coming off the best game of his career, and then Cincinnati went out and traded for Khalil Herbert. Now, really, that has a lot more to do with Zach Moss going on IR than them not trusting Chase Brown. This is still Chase Brown's backfield, but he had 32 touches last week. That cannot be a weekly thing. He would wear down. So the split in the backfield probably will return, and this is a tough matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Then we have Chuba Hubbard going up against the Giants. Now, I expect him to once again be the leader in the backfield for the Carolina Panthers, plus international games tend to be a little bit more run-heavy. And Hubbard hasn't had less than 17 touches in a game since week 2. Now, the Giants, more of a middle-of-the-pack type defense against opposing running backs, and that will keep Chuba Hubbard as a RB2 once again in week 10. Why is he not higher? Well, the Carolina Panthers have activated rookie running back Jonathan Brooks. Now, it is still not clear whether or not Brooks is actually going to play in this game or not. But if he does, and a few of these touches are taken away from Chuba Hubbard, that is going to lower the ceiling just a little bit. Then we go down to Najee Harris going up against Washington. He's coming off the bye and is playing great here as of late. 3 straight games with over 100 total yards, more touchdown chances with Russell Wilson under center, but this Washington defense has really been playing a little bit better here as of late. This is no longer some pushover type game for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But due to their commitment to Najee Harris and them moving the ball more down the field with Russell Wilson, I still got Najee inside tier 3 at number 23, and then Tony Pollard going up against the Chargers. And look at Tony P going back-to-back games with 115 plus total yards. His usage has been absolutely huge. Over the last 2 games, he has 54 total touches. Now, Tennessee has already come out and said, listen, we need to get creative and manage his workload a little bit, and obviously, he's probably going to practice a little bit less. But when we look at this matchup, it's a difficult one going up against the Chargers because they allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so Tony Pollard inside the top 24, but at 24. Which brings us to tier 4. Not a whole lot of names in tier 4. It's Rico Dowdle, Rashad White, Brian Robinson Jr., and Bucky Irving. Now for Rico Dowdle, I think you all know by now, I love talking about the Dallas run game. It's one of the worst overall run games in the entire NFL. And now they have a matchup going up against Philadelphia. But Dallas making Zeke a healthy scratch last week and only giving Dalvin Cook 7 snaps on offense tells us that we at least now know that Rico Dowdle will be the guy going forward. We also know that CeeDee Lamb is dealing with a shoulder injury and Dak Prescott probably not going to be on the field for quite some time. You have to expect Dallas to try to lean on the running game a little bit to take pressure off of Cooper Rush under center, but in a matchup going up against Philadelphia, who allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game, expectations just a little bit lower. Then we have Rashad White going up against San Francisco, and don't let the low yardage last week absolutely worry you. It was against Kansas City. the #1 running defense in the NFL, and Baker was having to throw the ball more down the field to keep pace. Now, White has been a much better fantasy option since the injuries in Tampa Bay, but once again, this is going to be a split backfield. However, the touchdown upside still lays with Rachaad White. And as of right now, it's the highest that it has been all year long. In a matchup going up against San Francisco, I can see some checkdowns going his way, and that's why he's still this high at tier 4. How about Brian Robinson Jr. going up against Pittsburgh? And he just can't seem to get back to full health. He hasn't had a game with over 50% of the snaps since week 4. Now, he should be back at practice this week, but the limitations need to be paid attention to throughout the week, because this is not some easy matchup going up against Pittsburgh, and if he's going to be limited, he may not be worth the risk. And then we got Bucky Irving, the other running back in Tampa Bay, going up against San Francisco, and he's going to continue to get right around 10 touches a week, but in this three-way split backfield, he is going to become a little bit more matchup dependent. And honestly, it doesn't really help that the Tampa Bay defense is allowing so many points to their opponents that Tampa Bay can't rely on the running game, because that's where Bucky Irving could really excel. With Tampa constantly trailing and having to throw, his volume just can't seem to creep up each week, which means we only have tier 5 left, where I got Isaac Guerendo, Javonte Williams, Raheem Mostert, Tank Bigsby, Austin Eckler, Travis Etienne, Ray Davis, and Jaylen Warren. But let's start off with Isaac Guerendo right here at the top, going up against Tampa Bay. It's just a great matchup going up against the Bucs. And if there are any Christian McCaffrey limitations, we could see San Francisco use a little bit more of the speed aspect that Isaac Guerendo brings to the table. We may know a little bit more as we head into the weekend, but as of right now, it would not surprise me if Guerendo still sees in the neighborhood of 12 touches or so this week. Now, after him, we got Javonte Williams going up against Kansas City, and it's starting to look like we are going to be having more of a three-way split in this Denver backfield, with word coming out that Audric Estime is getting a larger role. With that kind of split against the #1 running defense in the NFL, it's just not something to get excited about. Now, after him, we have Raheem Mostert going up against the Rams. He's highly touchdown dependent right now, hasn't had over 12 touches in a game since week 2. He just doesn't have the safety that Devon Achane does each and every week. Now, the Rams, they're not a tough matchup, but due to the lower volume here as of late, he's more of a risky flex play at best. Now, after him, we go down to Tank Bigsby going up against Minnesota. And now we get the pleasure of trying to figure out a split backfield in Jacksonville weekly. Great. That's an absolute nightmare on a team that is losing more often than not. Now a matchup going up against Minnesota as well, who allows the 5th fewest fantasy points per game. With us not knowing what this split is going to be, it's a nightmare in Jacksonville. Then we got Austin Eckler going up against Pittsburgh. The biggest question here surrounds the health and availability of Brian Robinson Jr. If Robinson can't go or is limited, we can look at Eckler as a flex option this week. If B-Rob ends up playing and the split is alive and well here in Washington against this Pittsburgh defense, it's a lot more risky. Then we go down to Travis Etienne against Minnesota. We already talked about the split in touches in a tough matchup here against the Vikings. Then we go down to Ray Davis, who's going up against Indianapolis. Now, he's only had 6 touches a game here for 3 straight weeks, but he continues to make sporadic big-time plays in this offense. And in a matchup going up against Indianapolis, not the toughest on the schedule. And then lastly, we got Jaylen Warren going up against Washington. We're starting to see him get a little bit more integrated into this overall offense. And if Washington can get a lead in this ball game and Pittsburgh is playing from behind, we can see Jaylen Warren a little bit more integrated into the passing game this week. So there you have the quick and dirty top 36 running backs here for Week 10 fantasy football. Now, it's great to have so many options at the running back position at this point of the season. You can see really 25 top-end guys. However, after the 25th guy, it drops off pretty quickly. So hopefully you have a few options on your roster that you can roll with here this week to walk away with a win in Week 10. Now, if you haven't hit the like button already, please do so, and then consider subscribing if you haven't done that yet either. It really helps us out here on YouTube, and I would love to have you join Headliner Nation. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.